Since the last time we looked at the Valentine, we've removed one of the suspension units and completely stripped it into its component parts. As you can see, even there's quite a few, including bearings and springs and castings and axle stub axles that you've seen on other suspensions that we worked at. And now what we've got to do is break it down further by making another special tool which will do this spring here. We're using some reference from a gentleman in New Zealand that's already done this, and we managed to find a World War II film of them actually making the suspension unit for a Valentine, which has been very useful. Often when we get these things apart initially, things like the bearings look in really bad order and they're quite caked up, but once they're cleaned, because of the limited travel of the suspension, they haven't actually had, you know, an awful lot of wear. So once cleaned up, we can reuse them, but every single one of them will be examined to make sure that that's okay. The things that suffer are the rubber seals. As I've already said, these are often filled with oil rather than grease, and these rubber seals, you can see they're grooved like a record here, which improves the sort of sealing capacity of them. And over the years, through heat and rubber generally tends to degrade. And we have a problem when it comes to things like this, because the actual cost of the seal is never all that much. What costs an awful lot of money is the die or the extruder or whatever has to be made in order to produce the seal in the first place. So there's obviously a bit of an economic question when we ask if we're going to replace them. We're obviously hoping for, when these computer line printers come in, that we can run these off at a much cheaper rate, but they'll definitely have to be replaced. We do some light work on the casing covers and things like that with the bead blaster. These will have to be blasted, sympathetically. We don't want to do it too hard, but we do want to sort of take the paint off and make sure that they're dressed properly, put another coat of paint on them, and that will protect them when we put them back on. Just talking about some of the individual points, this is a swing arm for the larger wheel of the suspension unit. It incorporates one of the mounts for the spring unit that sits in there. We had quite a job getting these off because of the rust damage that occurred on the bolts, and they're quite long anyway. Not much to get hold of. Obviously been on there a long time, and it did take quite a while to get these off. This is one of the stub axles that we talked about. Supports one of the wheels in the suspension unit. You can see it's quite a complicated machined piece of metal in the fact that it's tapered, lots of steps on it, lots of oil surfaces that the lip seals go on in order to hold the oil in. We've got to make sure that these surfaces are really good, because we're going to put new seals on them. There's two ways you can do it. You can get the metal sprayed and ground back down, or you can get these speedy sleeves that go onto them, that take up any sort of pitting in the shaft, which makes sure we get a good seal. Again, on the back here, we've got a bespoke rubber seal to hold the oil in. And on the front, the whole lot will be held in with a nut that's secured with a split pin. And because that's actually put in preload on the bearings, it's important that we don't tighten these up too much, as it will put the bearings under too much preload and then wear them out quicker. Also important that we don't put it on too slack, because if we do that, the road wheel won't be held firmly, and as it goes along, it'll get a thing called rim rot, where it shakes from side to side. If we can't locate the nut in the right place to put the split pin through, then we put shims in order to get it there while still maintaining the correct amount of preload on the bearing. And this is where we would shim it if we had to get it in the correct place and achieve the desired preload on the bearing. Finally then, over on this side, you see the other two components. This is the stub axle and pivot point for the other two road wheels, or bogie wheels in this case. And then the center, the joining part with the other mounting here. And these fit into these round assemblies on the side of the spring pack and hold it in position. It pivots, which compresses this spring, absorbing the ride and any bumps that we have. And again, like I said earlier, in order to recompress that spring so we can get this end off, we've got to make a special jig that holds it all in place safely, so that we can undo these nuts and then back it off, and then the whole thing will come apart. As you can imagine, there's a lot of seals and things in there, and they'll all be specialised, and we've got to really examine those and make sure that they're doing their job and keeping everything working. It's quite a big undertaking this. They've been on for an awful long time. None of these nuts and bolts want to come off, so we only get one chance at it. We don't want to ruin any of these castings, so we're using this one to take our time, learn the process, and then put the guys in place so that they can do it on the other 3. Okay, so Buzz is now in the process of doing the prep work to remove the second suspension unit. As I said, nothing on this tank wants to come off. It's been painted and been on an awful long time. And what he's doing now is getting all of the paint out of the threads on the road wheels. We've already taken the end cap off and the nut and the split pin that we talked about on the stub axle. Buzz is going to clean all those threads up before we put any tools on them. What happens is if you leave thick paint on the threads, as we unwind the nut, it all gums up, and 2 things will happen. You'll either break the bolt if it gets really severe, or at the very least you'll damage the threads, and we want to reuse these nuts as much as we can. Okay, apologies for the pasty hands cam, but we're having to do this ourselves because of the COVID restrictions. Matt and his amazing team sadly can't come down and film us. So we'll be giving you some shots using our own phones of how things are going on, and Matt will put it all together and make it look fantastic, I'm sure. The Valentine, I spoke about it earlier in an earlier vid. And we talked about the suspension and the fact that it was really knackered and we had to strip it down and rebuild it again. We're in the process now. We've got some parts from New Zealand and we're making some parts. Jacob's working very hard in engineering to make some replacement things that we just couldn't reuse again. One of the interesting things that's come out of working on the Valentine suspension is the amount of different ways that they've conjured up in order to do bearings. Now we can only assume that they ran out of certain materials and they had to think of other ways to do it. 2 of them are fairly regular. We've seen those before, and there's one I've never seen before in my life. So option 1, you can use a roller bearing. These can be needle bearings like this one, and it comes with the bearing set up on the outside and normally a sleeve on the inside which will fit on the bit that you want to rotate. Sits inside like that, spins round, pretty much the gold standard when it comes to bearings in that time. Next, if you run out of those bearings, then you can use phosphor bronze and put that round the outside and put a metal sleeve on the inside as we have before. The third thing, however, that we've seen on the Valentine, which I've personally never seen before, is a Tufnell outer. There you go. So you still get the steel insert, and you get a Tufnell outer bearing. I can only assume that these were made because they not only had they run out of proper bearings, but they'd also run out of phosphor bronze as well. So we're going to try and replicate the phosphor bronze bearings and make them in-house, so the vehicle goes back as it was originally, but I'm afraid the Tufnell ones will get replaced. All right, so just to give you some idea of the movement, because of the wear that's involved in here, if I assemble the stub axle now with its carrier, thrust bearing, the end cap, and normally this would go on the end and hold all that together. Now try to imagine as I'm doing this that this carrier for the top roller is over the top of all this, and you can see straight away the amount of wear that's involved with that. That should be a nice tight fit. Now what I'll do is I'll get Jacob to assemble it with the parts that he's made and demonstrate the improvements. One of the most active parts of any suspension on any vehicle is the springs or the shock absorbers that go onto it. If you think back to the Churchill, we had a broken spring on that, and we used the workshop manual and the engineering to build a tool in order for us to compress that spring, get it out of the unit that it was in and replace it. We have the same problem with the Valentine. The only difference is that we don't have a drawing of a compression tool in order to carry this out. So what we're doing is we're making one from scratch. We're using references from a guy in New Zealand called Andrew Rowe, who's done an amazing job restoring a Valentine, and we managed to find an historical film on YouTube of them actually building them in one of the factories. Just to orientate you then, in front we have what I regard as a spring pack. Contains a spring. That spring is held under compression. It needs to be, because it needs to maintain the ride height of the vehicle. It's no good having it completely extended because it would just be bumping on the bottom stops. So it's got what we call preload. So it's set to a certain preload that keeps the tank above the ground and allows a movement of the spring in both directions in order to compress when it goes over a bump, or to reassert in order to maintain the ride height. Because of that preload, we need to, this is effectively a bit of a bomb in that it's all held together by what I call a keep bolt, which is on the end, held in compression between two pads. And in order to get this thing apart so that we can service it, we need to recompress this spring to take off the tension that's on this keep bolt and undo it. That comes with the compressor that's on the back here. Now, for the really observant among you, you'll notice that this particular piece of bar is not unlike the ones that we made the legs out of to move the Matilda hull. We've recycled it, and with Bob Kendall's amazing engineering skills and the reference that we've already talked about, we've made, or starting to make, this compressor. Just to orientate you, these cutaway lugs at the back here fit into here. And the same is here. The only difference is this particular part of the tool is a carriage that works in conjunction with a jack. And when we've had it set up, we'll put the spring packet in here and locate it. And then using the jack, we'll move this carriage forward to put the spring under compression, therefore taking the load off of the keep bolt. That will allow us to undo it. And then we allow the jack to come back in that sort of fashion. And that'll allow the spring to reassert itself, and it'll probably go about a third of the current length that you see and take all of the pressure off. Once that's done, we can strip this whole unit apart, recondition it, replace seals, and put it all back together again using the same tool. We've managed now we've come back after being on furlough, to get it all the way down. But there's an awful lot of machining that needs to be done on this. You can see quite typically, we've got an end cap here, and the metal is just gone. So we have to remake these. These fit on the trunnions, which are over here. One of the larger items was this. You can see how pitted and awful it is. So how do you turn one of those out of a piece of steel? Well, first of all, we get a bit of steel about the same diameter, and we practice how to do the screw cut in and what procedures we're going to use, what order we're going to do them in. And then we get our bare steel and we make the cylinder. Original sort of width is still there, and then we turn it down and put the thread on the end. And then finally turn the old end cap, which is rusty, and in fact we had to mill it to get it off because it was rusted in, and make a new one using the original as a pattern. It's important that we do these practice runs because we don't want to waste the expensive material that we've ordered and bought for the new part. And so we do this for every stage of the milling and the turning in order to make the part. And one of the jobs that we had to do was to convert these, which are trunnion caps that hold the bearings on the trunnions for the return spring. And you can see there's an awful lot of metal that's gone there. So we've taken the 4 caps and measured them up and come up with some dimensions. And then our wizard with the lathe, which is Jacob, has then converted what we did have to a brand new cap. You see these rings on the back, they work in conjunction with a rubber seal that fits in there that we've got from our friend in New Zealand. And those rings actually are kind of in conjunction with the rubber, turn them into a lot of O-rings that hold the oil within inside the bearing that's normally located inside this cap. I'm sure you agree, excellent piece of work. 3 more of these to go for this suspension unit, and another 12 for the other 3. We've done a lot of machining and we're almost ready to start putting together the first suspension unit. Down on the bench here then, we've got the rear trunnion unit with our rear trunnion caps that we've made up, and we've put a base coat on that. That's all ready to rock and roll. You'll see the main cylinder here. That's all been machined by Jacob. And the other trunnion for the suspension unit on the bottom there again with remade caps. Now we've dry fitted the internals together. Big shout out to Andrew Rowe in New Zealand, who's sent us an awful lot of photographs showing these bits and bobs and a few tricks and traps that he found along the way. And also supplied us with a seal kit which we're going to use to renew the old ones that are obviously worn out beyond repair.
We have a fantastic selection of books, models, clothes and other gifts on the Tank Museum online shop. When you buy from our online shop, you are supporting the Tank Museum charity, and that means we can carry on caring for our collection and producing this content. If you have supported us already, thank you very much, subscribe and do keep watching.